All right, so we should be back at PowerPoint, Fall 1 reports, and we'll just try to briefly and quickly try to go over the reports. What time is the end? We have the next two slides kind of help map out the linkage between reports. Also, if you're using the CalPad user manual and you go to the mapping guides, how reports are linked is described in the mapping guides as well. But essentially, what you see before you is this kind of green teal type of color. These are all the aggregate reports that are required to certify. This is the product of the data submission. The warnings and the errors are kind of put in there to help make sure your data is complete and accurate. But what what's going to be used for LCFF or to meet the child find requirements for the Individual Disability Act or for monitoring for ESSA, right? Those counts are going to be present in these aggregate reports. So report 1.1.17, 1.24, those just provide counts, right? There's no easy relationship between the individual student's record and these counts. What you have to use are the orangish kind of color, salmon, Marshall's favorite color, kind of orange pinkish, right? That is identifying these supporting reports. So if you're new to CalPads, you might open and run 1.1 and have your enrollment count, and it may not be accurate, or you don't know why it's inaccurate. You would go to report.2 and you would see a student list, and these reports can be filtered by school. And this is kind of the critical thinking. This is the exercise in verifying those reports are correct. And you might see a discrepancy. Might be a specific class of students that is off at an elementary school. It might be the whole school for some reason. It might be the grade levels. Students' grade levels weren't updated. It could be in any number of things in which you might identify a discrepancy that requires changes. So that's how you use the reports. Of course, you verify counts, make sure they're in the general vicinity. And then when you're trying to get them exact or as close as possible, you use the aggregate reports to see the students listed just to make sure they're populated. One of the reports that often requires specific attention is 2.1, Title III eligible immigrants. Sometimes they're overreported and sometimes they're underreported because in addition to the student's birth country and their age, there's an indicator in the demographics that will say, has the student been enrolled less than 3 cumulative years? And if you don't uncheck it, if you leave it checked, even if it's year 5, that student will show up in the counts and they're not eligible. Or if you don't check it and it's their first year enrollment, the student won't be counted and you'll try to figure out why they're not being counted. So that's the reason why we provide you the linkage so you can understand how to reconcile the reports. And just more of that on the next page. I will point out these 3 at the bottom have a different color. They're the same report, .1, but one is the student profile list. So before we had read-only access in CalPads, it was the most extensive report that you can easily extract and provide to staff. Now that you can give people read-only access count, maybe it's not in great demand. And then 8.1a student profile exits. So rather than just trying to look for dropouts and finding exit reasons, the profile exit list is good. Can identify why students may not be counted if they were exited before census day. It's just, it could help you resolve ERDs. So you're looking at the exit reasons you were using for students. And then 8.1b is a list of dropouts just for your LEAs, those exit reason codes that would identify a student as dropout. And then on the right, you have COE reports. There's many county office reports. You only have visibility to these reports if you have a county office account. So if you're at a district and you want to look at a county office report, sorry, you can't. All right, report 1.1 enrollment, primary and short-term enrollment count by subgroup. This report has been modified this year. I'm assuming Kyron updated the slide. I don't remember doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see the snapshot date. I can see
Yeah.
the snapshot, and so I know that it was updated. And the reason why 1.1 was updated is because they've modified the LCFF report, which is now the title. We used to always call it the LCFF report, but it used to be a long name like FRMP. You know, it was related to 1.17 and 1.18. That title changed, and so now when you're trying to identify subgroups for your complete enrollments, you want to look at 1.1. The LCFF report has been modified to specifically look for just those students eligible for funding. So that age eligibility filter was removed from the 1.17. We'll talk more about that later. But you can see the different subgroups of students listed. And I would imagine this report will continue to grow. It seems like every 2 years they're adding a new column of information. And you can see column 11 has the FRMP eligible. One thing to note is your socioeconomically disadvantaged. That's a federal count. Although this will include most of the students that are on 1.117, it won't be all of them, right? Because the socioeconomically disadvantaged count will include any student that has the parent ed level of not a high school graduate. I believe that's 14. And it also, you have your English learners here, but English learner is not a qualifying criteria for socially economically disadvantaged. However, it is a category in the LCFF. So you just have to understand that why the counts would be different between this one and then what we call, LCFF disadvantaged subgroup. And then report 1.2 is just the exact same report as 1.1. However, it's the student list. So you can see you have your students, some demographic information, grade level, ethnicity, all that good stuff, right? Primary enrollment status. But then you have the same columns, and this helps you identify where the discrepancy is, right? If there's overcounting or undercounting the students, you could find out who should be listed, who shouldn't be listed, so on and so forth. Then report 1.5 is another version of 1.1. It's a primary enrollment report, but this one shows you the race ethnicity breakdown, and there's in the footer it tells you how it's calculated. So a student who's missing won't have any race or ethnicity populated, right? Just two indications of no or missing or an NA, whatever your local systems collect. Multiple is those students who have multiple races but are not Hispanic or do not have a Hispanic ethnicity. And then Hispanic is going to be any student, regardless of race missing that identifies or as Hispanic. And then you have your Asian and Filipino categories, which sometimes get discussion. I think Kyron explained the breakdown a bit earlier. So there you go. That's that report. Report 1.17, unduplicated pupil count, is now the new title, right? LCFF unduplicated pupil count used to have a much longer name, and it was a subgroup report. And again, it was changed just to identify those students who are eligible for LCFF funding. So the age eligibility filter is gone. Your foster counts may be increased this year significantly. In previous years, the involuntary foster youth were not identified for purposes of CalPADS or LCFF. And reading the definitions of that group, it was determined that they should be included. So those students that are voluntary placed are now included. So that's, I'm in a tough situation for whatever reason. And I find that, the state doesn't need to take my kids. It's probably best that I leave them with someone, whether that's through going through the court and they end up with a family member, or going through the court and they're with a foster family, whatever the case. that voluntary placement is that group of students is now included where previously they weren't. And so that's a large group of students, right? So in previous years, many people would want to know, I have this foster student, why are they not identified? Well, if they were voluntary placement, they weren't eligible for LCFF funding, therefore not identified in CalPADS. So you should see an increase in that column 5 there. Column 4, free and reduced. Again, those are all the students with the program 181 and 182 record. So the students that have been identified through alternative form or traditional NSLP application, students that are identified as a direct cert through a county process outside of CalPADS, they would be identified there as well. You have your tribal foster youth. Those are students that you have given a program code of 193. This is one of the newer programs and one of the toughest because there's not a lot of literature or instruction on how to identify these students. So, you know, somewhere within the county, there has to be a relationship with, you know, the tribal organizations, and those students that are tribal foster youth would be reported as such. But it doesn't seem as straightforward from doing these trainings, the guidance and how to establish those relationships or how to get those counts verified doesn't seem to be as straightforward. So if you're in the chat box and you have a process, feel free to share with your peers. Then the Migrant 135 program, Kyron talked about it. Those students are reported, as well as homeless, program 191. And so with tribal foster youth, homeless, and migrant, these students are called categorically eligible, right? And so they will be counted if they have a program record. And subsequently, they're also eligible for free and reduced lunch. You don't need to give them a program record because the students count it, not an NSLP program record. You can for your own purposes, but CalPADS doesn't need that because the migrant, the homeless, and the tribal foster youth program codes is sufficient. But we point those 3 out because if a student is directly certified or they're eligible based on a meal application or alternative form, their siblings as well, right? Because the meal application is based on household eligibility. So if one student in the household is eligible, they are all. Same with direct certification. So I don't have the link in front of me, but there's a resource that says this specifically. If you go to NSLP, CDE, direct certification, it explains that. There's a nice little chart, but just something to keep in mind. So as you have universal meals and you're trying to increase your CEP or your provision 3, just identify if one sibling is identified as direct certification, you know, you want to account for the other students as well in that household. So that's something, and you would have to give them a program 181 or 182 record if they're not also identified, but that works for application and direct certification, but not homeless, migrant, or tribal foster youth. So if me and Kyron were brothers and he didn't know how to follow rules because he's a hardhead and he ran away, he would be eligible for free lunch because he's homeless, but I'm not necessarily eligible if other criteria wouldn't be met. And so you have your column 10, unduplicated eligible free and reduced meal counts. That is just the program 181. You know, that's essentially all the preceding columns, but not added together. If a student is qualified in multiple columns, are only counted once in column 10, but it's any student in any of the preceding columns from left to right is going to be in column 10. But again, just remember it's unduplicated, so they're counted once. So if they're both identified through direct cert and also are foster, that one student is going to be counted once in column 10, but may show up in both of those other columns. And then you have your English learners. Those students are eligible who are identified as EL on Census Day or before. And then the total number of those students is column 12. That's the key there. That's, again, unduplicated. So you can't reconcile this report from left to right. It won't add up. If you had to reconcile this report, you'd have to use report 1.18. And then you can see a student might be eligible in multiple categories from column 10 to column 17. So a student may be EL and migrant, or may be eligible for free lunch and also identified as a foster youth. So report 1.24 is kind of new. I think it was implemented last year. It's just the dropout by subgroup. So you can see, if you have a significant group of students or one of these disadvantaged subgroups that are, producing more dropout students than another group, you can, focus your local efforts on that specific subgroup. And you can also see what, state and federal agencies are looking at. Report 2.1, Title III eligible immigrants. These are all the students who are identified as Title III eligible immigrants because they have 3 years or less of cumulative enrollment. They were born outside the US and Puerto Rico. Even, sometimes we get questions, what if a military base? Well, if their military base was in Okinawa, Japan, even though that, they're American students, they were in Japan, they were born in Japan. So they're going to be qualified. That doesn't exclude them. That's generally the question we get a lot of times. Or, students' parents could be teachers abroad, and a student can be definitely an American student, but they're going to be an eligible immigrant if they, were born in a foreign country and then came back home. So that's, how you can account for the counts. And then the supporting report would be how you identify those students. In report 2.8, English language acquisition, that's the ELAS abbreviation, count by primary language. So you have a count of the primary language identified as of Census Day. So you notice you have your TBD column, right? Unfortunately, TBD is potential funding loss, because if they were EL, and once they're TBD, they're either going to be EL or IFEP. So that's a number you want to keep down. Sometimes it's not possible. Students may enroll late, may transfer. It's hard to get them tested and identified, what have you. But that is definitely one of the columns, this year, next year, and into the future, you don't want to see represented significantly, is that TBD column. And then report 2.9, English language acquisition status Census Day comparison. It's a comparison basically from last year to this year. So last year's Fall 1 counts to this year's Fall 1 count. So, again, the numbers should kind of line up. If your enrollment increase, you would expect perhaps your accounts to increase across the board, or vice versa, decrease. We're coming off a couple of years of COVID. Some parents were hesitant to send their students back to school. Perhaps enrollment's up across the board. Who knows? Maybe they all moved to Texas. Then you have your 8.1A through C student profile list. So you can see the report has been chopped in half. So it's quite lengthy from left to right. And if someone would like, someone that you authorize to see the student data, you could print this report out and give it to them, and it shows them, a lot of information. It might be just as easy to give someone a read-only account in CalPADS. So, but that is the most extensive report we have based on student information. And then we have our reports for students with disabilities. Report 16.1, education plan by primary disability count. This identifies the eligibility disability for students. So, at the top, you can see one of the 14 disability categories, primary disabilities. This is the reason why your student has been found eligible for special education services. And then probably the third column on the left, it will list their active plan, their, whether 100, 200, or 150. But as well as, I think it will also report those plans that are not active. So the reasoning for maybe a student being tested, it could be pending or found ineligible. And then you have students with disability count federal setting. And so these are definitely active plans because you're in a setting and they're receiving services. And so you have your different settings across the top, right? And then that disability category that was across the top in the previous report is listed in about the third column down. So they're going to see if the services or the settings are, you can see at the top, we have intellectual disability. You would expect to see some consistency because those students have a similar disability or have been identified and has the same disability. And you can see the different settings. Like I said, I think it's reasonable to think there should be some consistency. And it's called least restrictive environment because as much as possible, you want your students with disabilities to be receiving general education. So at the far right, you can see the general education participation column. And there's 3 columns, right? The student in general education, 40% or less, between 40 and 80%, or 80% or more. So that's 16.2. And then we have 16.3, which is the supporting report. And it's a combination of the previous 2 because it's, it's a supporting report. So you get more details of the education plan, the meeting dates, at least the meeting dates that have identified your student's inclusion into the report 16.1 to 16.2, and more information about the plan type, or if the student is participating, like their setting, or they're participating if they're in a school age setting, so on and so forth. So it's also lists the students, by name. We kind of blacked it out. I don't think we have fake student with disability data, so we had to kind of black the name out. So you have the race, ethnicity information, and it helps you identify students that should be included that were not in 16.1 to 16.2. And then you have 16.5, students with disability student service. So this is the data that comes from your SSRV for your students with disability. The previous 3 were focused on the SPED file, and these would be the SSRV. And it expands to where you can see the services provided. A student may be counted multiple times because a student can receive various services for a single disability. So keep that in mind. So in these counts, you see the services category, you see the service code that has been reported, and the total number of students. So again, it's not a one-for-one. Student can receive multiple services, and it tells you, the service for the disability category. That would be the student's primary disability. And then you have students with disability student services. This is the student list. So again, 16.6 is used to reconcile 16.5. You want to identify the student and the services reported. I don't know if this is 2 years old or it was introduced last year. Report 1611, Students with Disability Annual Comparison Report. You just compare the counts of students with disabilities from last year to this year, similar to the English Language Acquisition Status Comparison Report. And then you can see how it looks when it's expanded. And so Kyron talked about how to certify. Again, you have to make sure that all your reports on the left, the aggregate reports, have green checks. Fall 1 is extensive, so you're going to have to scroll down to see all of the reports. And if you're, really doing accounting of your data, you will be viewing probably every report in the right-hand column as well. So just keep that in mind. Slides here because you want to focus on the snapshot generation. I don't want to confuse anybody, but you want to make sure that the data in the report you're looking at, that report was generated with the corresponding snapshot. Just so you do the same thing when you're resolving errors. Sometimes you have to be patient. If you certify why, we had to wait several cycles sometimes for errors to clear. So on top of known issues, on top of everything else, sometimes it just takes patience. So be focused on your snapshot create date and the revision ID right next to it when you're looking at your reports. It's more of the same of how to do that. The revision ID is important if you have approved a version of a report and then disapproved. When you're talking to your SELPA, make sure you identify the revision ID for the report and tell them the status. When they're looking at reports, it will default to the disapproved every time. So if you're working on a revised uncertified version of reports and you're waiting for their approval before you go ahead and approve it, make sure when you're communicating with your SELPA that it provides revision ID, and sometimes it's helpful to tell them what status. And then this is what your SELPA sees. So your SELPA may have many LEAs, right? And they might have a first in, first out method where whoever's ready to have us review their data first, we'll do that in that order. So it might behoove you to not wait to the last minute. So if you're having difficulty now, please submit a ticket. Don't wait for CalPAS to fix itself. Even if you think it's a known issue, we'll confirm that, list you if there's something that's beyond your control. But this is what the SELPA has a view of.